Welcome back to another episode Out of the Blank podcast. I'm here with Jess. Now, do you like Jess or Jessica?
It doesn't matter. Either, both works. Jessica's fine.
I just want to make sure because I know you were on in the past, and I don't know if we've hit that friend barrier where I can call you Jess. But you ever come across somebody who's like, say your name, but it's not your name? Like I get called randomly at work. Some coworker I work with for the past year and a half has just called me Tim, and I've just gone with it, and I haven't it's now I'm too into it to say, hey, my name is actually Robbie. It's not Tim, so I don't know what to do at this point.
I mean, I was born the year that Jessica was the most popular baby name, and second most popular baby name was like Nicole. And so people would just be like, or they'll just like give me like some generic name. They'll be like, oh yeah, that girl Sarah. I'll be like, oh, actually it's Jessica. Or like, oh, that girl Nicole. I'm like, no, it's Jessica. Like it's, but so I just like, I'll just go with it sometimes, especially like older people where I'm like, I must look like somebody they know with that like very generic name. I just have like dark hair and light eyes like a million other people, so
You
it's
kind of
fine.
look like a Susan to me.
As long as you don't call me Karen, like we're cool.
That name's completely just off the books now. Like I feel so bad for anybody that even has that name. It's like now you're going to be associated for the rest of your life as a Karen.
Yeah,
Oh,
definitely.
you know what? But something I feel like you're probably the best person to talk to about this because I just watched a bunch of videos on this and I'm a bit of a conspiracy guy. I like to dive down those rabbit holes, but I wanted to ask you, what are your thoughts about the Titanic? Like, how much do you know?
Um, I mean, I know like enough. I have some friends who are like very obsessed with the Titanic and have been for a long time. And I actually went to school at the University of Rhode Island. So Bob Ballard, who found the Titanic, he's like a fellow there, and his research vessel docks there, and he like works with a lot of students there. Every year he like sponsors a big like Titanic themed dinner for all the undergrads to like attend, and they like do up the dining hall and they serve the same menu and stuff. Um, but I mean, I know more about it from like how it was discovered and like significance archaeologically and things like that. I haven't dove into the conspiracies around it like too much.
Okay, because there are a lot of conspiracy theories with that. And I was just, this is a great topic because April 10th is the day it set out in 1912. And then April 14th was the day that it
Same,
apparently
yeah.
wrecked by an iceberg. I'm putting emphasis on the word iceberg because I was listening to a podcast and they were talking about the guy, I think is Varuk or Vadukt. Bayrut is his name. He was in oh god, I'm gonna blank on what he was. He was a publicist that at the age of 25 years old was one of the survivors of the Titanic. But he was talking about his story and he wrote multiple books on it. And he was talking about how it was actually an explosion in the lower part of the ship, not really an iceberg that brought it down. And it's crazy because at this point, I think with how much information that we have on it, we know that it was an iceberg. We saw Leonardo DiCaprio go down in the sea and everything like that. But it leaves the question, is there a possibility? Like, I'm not with it with the fact of like it could be a separate ship, like the Olympic is what they were calling it, like putting a nameplate over it and then acting like it was all like a money scheme or something like that, because there was 1,500 people that died. But when it comes to like the fact of was it an iceberg or was it a ship malfunction, it'd be something easy to cover up.
Well, so I think it was an iceberg. I think that like now we know like in terms of like navigational technology and how ships work is completely different now. So to put on a 2021 perspective onto 1912 like ship navigation technology, of course there's going to be things that people just don't understand. I think that after the ship sank, they interviewed every single survivor. Like everyone had to go and give deposition, and they talked to people, and all kinds of crazy stuff happened with survivors. Like there was a woman, I can't remember her name, but she was like cast in a movie about the Titanic, and the only way they would cast her is if she wore the dress that she was wearing on the night that she like survived. And so she said yes because she was trying to like break into Hollywood. So I think that if you go back and look at all of those, like first person accounts, like everybody experienced something totally different. So that person, like maybe from their perspective, it did seem like an explosion. Like I can't imagine how loud that must have been if you were nearby. And then also if you think about like how steam engines work and like different things that were going on and like the process of the ship sinking and falling apart and different things that were happening, every time a water hit a boiler, there would have been an explosion. Anytime water hit an electrical box, there could have been an explosion. Um, so, there was all different kinds of things that were happening. So maybe for him, it felt like there was this loud noise and it felt like an explosion. And, then, this happened. And so it must have been an explosion. But that part of the Atlantic was fraught with icebergs. And again, like many of those icebergs are no longer there because of global climate change and, different sea processes and salinity changes and like all kinds of, things. So it's different to travel across the Atlantic now than it would have been then. Um, but I trust the scientists that have been like spent their entire lives like investigating this ship. And, like I think it was an iceberg. I don't think that you can get like, imagine like a big game of telephone, right? Like the story changes over time, and then you put that in 1,000 year, like 1,000 different people over 100 years. Like, of course, different things are going to appear to be different ways. But I also don't think that you can ever get 1,000 people to agree on a story, even if you wanted to. And so it'd be really hard to like cover up something like that when you have 1,000 survivors.
It's just so hard because, like, for especially for a lot of people, like, if I would not have started this podcast, would have never met you, I would have never had any valuable information to be able to, or someone at least with some experience in this field, like underwater archaeology, for instance, just to be able to talk to and bounce questions off of. Like, I'm at Hollow Earth seems very, very convincing on some things until I talked to a volcanologist. I was like, I have to ask you because you study this stuff. So it makes sense I would ask you about these types of things. But I mean, you watch these videos and you hear these accounts. I mean, I didn't even think about the perspective that you were thinking of like how loud the bang was, how loud of this. Because in his story, he was talking about that, like he was up at a bar late with a couple of his cabin mates that he met on the ship, and as they retired back to the room, like very, very late in the night, like right as it was turning April 14th, there was just this loud explosion, and one of their bunkmates had fallen off the top bunk and hit his head on the ground, and they were carrying him out of the room to safety, not knowing that they were never going to be able to return to that room again. And as they
Hmm.
got to the front of the ship or whatever, the ship broke into two, and then the one end that didn't sink immediately started capsizing, started going up, and they reached all the way up to the peak, and they jumped off, and they were immediately separated. But I mean, we're talking about like, we joked about in our very first recording about like, I would be, as a guy, I would be like, hey, women and children first. What about me? And I would try and like fight people for the spot. But they were talking about these lifeboats, and he was sinking in the water. He said that his arms went cold, his legs went cold. He just started drifting, and a lifeboat had come by, but they would not let him on because it might weigh the boat down, and then all of them would drown. And then
Hmm.
he passed out, and he talks about waking up on a ship. And it was one of the ships that was passing by actually, I think a few days later landed in New York, and then he spent 12 days in a hospital where he actually met one of the people there that saved his life, because what he thought was that the lifeboat left him. In reality, the woman that actually saved his life by saying that he was her son. So, because she was like, I just lost my husband on the ship. You have to save my son. And they saved his life. Then he told her, she told him in the hospital, hey, this is what happened. Here's the story. We actually didn't leave you. I saved your life, got you on the ship, and we got you to safety and everything like that. And it's just so weird because you hear that side of things, and you hear about him never seeing an iceberg, him thinking that it was an explosion. And you start wondering, like, how many times have we been across something, or we've seen something in history, for instance, that have, I would say, been a little bit like iffy, like especially about some of the stuff. Like they always reveal something comes out later to be false that we always thought to be true.
Yeah, I think there's like, again, that's like a lot of different perspectives. I also think that in like the particular case, oh, sorry, I'm in my car, so we're getting some weird noises. I think in the case of the Titanic, you know, they say that like freezing to death is actually like a really confusing but peaceful way to go because it's like falling asleep, right? Like your body shuts down, starting at your extremities, moving like internally, and it feels like falling asleep. And so I would imagine that would be like incredibly confusing to kind of like piece that together, like especially if you've ever, like sometimes when you're falling asleep and you don't feel like you're asleep, but then you like jostle awake and you realize like, oh, I've been asleep for an hour, but you were like dreaming really lucidly.
Yeah.
I imagine it would be like really confusing. Um, but I also think that there's always parts of stories that we're not gonna know when we experience it, right? Like if you were in a plane crash, what you would experience as a passenger is totally different than what you would experience as a pilot or like a flight attendant, or what you experience in the back of the plane might be different than what you experience at the front of the plane. And so when you're looking at a shipwreck, you have to factor in like, crew and rank, but then ships from this particular time period also like economic station. Like if you're a very wealthy first class passenger versus a steerage passenger, your experience is going to be completely different. And then also, if you think about like trauma, right? Like if you're a steerage passenger and you're leaving Europe because you've been experiencing like famine or trauma or economic, like downturn or some reason that's like really propelling you to like leave and start a new life, your perspective of like the extremeness of the situation might be different than someone who was just like on vacation. Like you might be conditioned to experience hardship a little bit different than somebody else. And so then the story that you tell is going to be different because, like you're like, yeah, it was cold and like whatever, like I fell in a lake before, like, oh, it was like that one winter where we had no firewood, where like the upper class people are going to be like, they turned me out without letting me dress like for the evening, and then I had to sit in the same boat as all these poor people. Like, it's just going to be a totally, totally different experience. And so those perspectives change, which is also why the Titanic case was at court for like years and years. Like it went through a huge admiralty trial and claim because because there are instances of insurance fraud in maritime history, like big instances of insurance fraud.
They
And
called it Greek
so,
lightning back in the day.
yeah, and there's all kinds of other ones too, where like there's all these cases where people like say that they're shipping some kind of like really like fragile cargo, like something that's known to go bad. So like maybe like it's like wheat or something that like if it gets wet, it's just going to be ruined. And they're like, yep, we loaded this ship up with like 2 tons of wheat and we shipped it across. And by the time it got to the Caribbean, it was all ruined. But they never actually put the wheat on the ship. They just knew that they could like get away with the insurance fraud of it. So as time goes on, admiralty court and admiralty law gets like more and more intense. So by the time you get to 1912 in the Titanic, you have this like huge legal system to kind of investigate those kind of things to make sure it's not a huge conspiracy or a purposeful insurance fraud or someone making a play for money. And of course, like it's still going to happen, but I think the likelihood of it happening on a passenger ship is way less than the likelihood of happening at, say, on like a cargo ship. On a cargo ship there's like 10 crew members. On a
Yeah.
passenger ship, there's like 100. So it just, it's totally different.
That's just so crazy to me because I wonder now I start to think about how difficult is your job to be able to try and find the actual truth or find the information based on like mentioned a lot of insurance fraud scams back in the day. They're thinking for themselves, honestly, if they look into the future, they don't know if their thing is going to be looked upon. And then people are trying to sift through everything and be like, is this insurance fraud? Is this an actual thing? What's this? And they start going down this rabbit hole of a conspiracy theory. And the next thing you know, it turns out not to be true. It just makes it more difficult to be able to find the facts, especially in a time now where it seems like facts are, that's the main thing everybody's searching for. Everybody's trying to put exposure on government and all these other types of things to be able to find the truth in something. It makes kind of everything open to the possibility.
It does. I totally get that, but I think that at the same time, like that's why there's people like me, right, who become super specialized experts in like one particular thing. I think that like now with like everyone getting into conspiracy theories and like really like going down all these different rabbit holes, like you can't expect one person to be an expert in everything, right? Like what is the saying? It's like a mile wide and an inch deep. Like you can know a tiny bit about a lot of things, but you have to trust in the people who have spent their lives and their careers like really exploring and studying like one particular subset and one particular field, because they have the ability to dive into that a lot deeper. But also because maybe we know things or ways to research or ways to look at things that we've developed over a long time that maybe it just doesn't like necessarily occur to you. One of the things, like this actually just happened yesterday and I totally never even thought about it. And this is my field. is like in the Civil War, photographers who covered like the battles, didn't want to go to every battle, right? Because it's super dangerous. So at whatever battle they were at, they would take a bunch of pictures, and then they would keep a few pictures behind to publish with the article about the next battle, so that they didn't have to go, right? Because all the battles had some like fundamentally similar things, like, soldiers fighting each other in the middle of a field. So if I'm like at Manassas taking photos, and then Gettysburg happens, rather than like trying to get to Gettysburg and take pictures, maybe I'm just going to publish a few pictures from Manassas and say they're at Gettysburg. And in that moment, that totally makes sense to that photographer, right? They think I'm protecting my own safety. But now as historians, when we look back and we're like trying to figure out different like, strategies and different battlefield movements from pictures, it's like, okay, like, is it like, is it not? Can I trust this? So there is apparently, I literally just found this out yesterday, a whole niche of Civil War historians who do what they call forensic photography. And they look at like tree shape and structure, fence construction, houses, buildings, even like stone walls, and compare them to see what photographs were really taken at what battlefields. Um, because they can't rely on necessarily the photographers of the time to, you know, mark which photos were really taken where.
Yeah,
So like,
it's even a bigger factor too, is if you look at like anybody's photos on Instagram or something, they're all uniquely different in such a way. It can be the same exact picture, but it's a little bit different. And I think it's because the perspective of the way you're seeing is different from the perspective of somebody else seeing it. But the fact that, like, if you look at D-Day, for instance, everybody coming off the boats, any war game that happens to do around the same thing with D-Day, they use the same exact main photos that everyone has seen before over and over and over again. So it might be a different video game, but it's the same exact photography. But you're talking about blending it. Like if you have a one war, dude takes a bunch of pictures and then he's like, well, I also took this pictures of this war, but it's the same photos from the original one that they were looking at in the first place. They're just saying it's from that other one.
yeah, because they don't want to go stand on like this battlefield on this date and then like hightail it over to this other battlefield on the next day. But like D-Day is also a really good example, right? Like most of the images and things that we see are just from Omaha. And if you look at a map of D-Day, and if you look at any kind of like troop movements from D-Day, there is multiple landing zones, right? But the reason that we generally look at that same one is because that's the most gruesome. That's where the most ferocious fighting was happened. That's where there was the largest loss of life. So, it's called collective memory, is what it's called. Like as a society, when we think of D-Day, we think of this one particular spot. And Tom Hanks did a lot to like perpetuate that, which is good, because like the horrors of war do need to be understood. Like it shouldn't be romanticized. But there was other landing sites, there was other things going on at the same time. Like D-Day wasn't just a beach landing, there was also people who were airdropped there. It took a lot of planning, it wasn't something that they just put together in a minute. So the collective memory of all of us as a society thinks about just that one part. But then when you go and say like, okay, where was everyone going, what were the shore fortifications, how many vessels were used, there's a way bigger picture than what we actually necessarily the first thought that comes to your mind.
Would you consider this a prime importance, I would say, of technology, the fact that we're able to record a lot of things like right at the moment that it's happening, so we have multiple accounts?
I mean, I think that is a really important part of it. I think that we're getting to a point where we might be oversaturated with data. um, One of the examples that some colleagues of mine use is like, if you had to analyze a picture, right? Like if you were doing like a Where's Waldo, and Waldo was like 1 pixel, like he was just 1 pixel large. If you were looking for him in 1990, right, you would only need like a TV screen to really like look at each pixel to find him. But if you were doing it today, you would need like the entire wall of a huge building to be able to go through pixel by pixel to try to find him. So, you know, there's really great things that happen with it. Like everyone having a phone in their hand can be like a really good thing. But also it just creates like so much more data to go through to do like a really comprehensive analysis or to get a really comprehensive story. And then now, because everyone has the opportunity to be a data collector, right? We have to work even harder to make sure that like we're getting a good sample, to make sure that everybody who's holding the camera doesn't like look the same, have the same experiences, to make sure that like we're getting, you know, diverse and interesting perspectives, and it's not just the same group of people always presenting the information. Um, so it's like it's great, but it also presents its own challenges. I think that in 100 years, like people looking back at this time period that we're living through right now will be really, really interesting to like see how they do it or what they do, or, you know, like how do you utilize Instagram as a historic research like tool? You know, when there's millions of users, like how do you use Twitter as a historic research tool? So it'll be cool, but it's not a problem I'm going to have to deal with. I'll hopefully be long gone by then.
They're gonna be looking back like, why in 2020 was everybody wearing masks in all their commercials? Like, it's very, very strange. And then they learn about the great pandemic or whatever, and that just goes down a whole. Has that affected your work at all, like research wise? I know besides maybe stay working it from home for a little bit, but like, have you been able to go back out in the field or work on anything new?
I haven't. I am not going to be able to go back in the field probably for another like 9 to 10 months. So one of the things about, there's two kinds of archaeology, really. There's archaeology that's like kind of ahead of the bulldozer, right? Like archaeology associated with putting in new roads or putting in like telecom lines or putting in pipelines. It's called cultural resource management, and it happens on a per project basis. So that has still been kind of going on. But archaeology that I generally do is more academic in nature. So it's normally like a little bit more long-term projects or projects that are seeking to answer a question about a specific site. So all of my work that I do in that regard has been delayed. And because of like the way grants work and the way funding works, the way universities work, um, you have to like apply for the money, right? And then you get the money, and then you have like a certain amount of time to spend the money, and then you have to write a report about, you know, what you found out. And so those all go in kind of annual cycles. And because when the cycles like came up, they were like the vaccine hadn't really rolled out yet, because most of the cycles are like January, February time. They basically just said like 2021's a wash. Like let's try again in 2022. So it'll probably like hopefully not this upcoming summer, but next summer, I'll be able to actually get back out in the field and do some cool stuff.
Are you missing
In
it?
the meantime, am I missing it?
Yeah.
Um, I miss the people mostly. Like I do miss it. I miss like beautiful clear water and like the excitement of the work and being outside all day every day. Um, but I mostly miss my colleagues and the people that I work with, because they're all really great people. And the only time we, you know, get to interact or socialize is like academic conferences or field projects. And also the communities that we work with. You know, it's hard to justify spending money sometimes on things like archaeology when you go into communities that have just like been totally decimated by the pandemic. A lot of the communities that we work in are completely tourism driven. So the people that I work with, like in the Caribbean and the Bahamas, um, you know, their entire economy is based on tourism. So it's hard to be like, yeah, I'm super sad that I can't like come to your beautiful country and just like look at shipwrecks for like a month, when I know that like the people there who have been our friends and allies are like really struggling. Um, so it's just, you know, 20 I feel like 2021 is kind of like an extension of 2020. It's just, you know, at least there's like hope on the horizon now of
Yeah.
it being over soon.
What about is this giving you at least time to plan like what your next voyage or what your next going to be research find or something is going to be?
It is and it isn't. The main project that I was working on is kind of postponed indefinitely. And then I have a few colleagues who are like really heavy in the planning phases. It's just hard to like lock down dates. I have been able to work on some stuff that's like not field work dependent, so like more history kind of stuff, which has been nice and different. But I mean,
What
there's only
types of
so many
history?
hours a day you can. So I've been looking at a lot of World War II history stuff. One of the things that I'm really interested in right now, which is kind of a blend of psychology, movie making, and history, is there's all these films that use the London Blitz, like the period that the Nazis were bombing London, um, as like a catalyst to tell other stories, especially children's stories. So if you think about like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the catalyst of that story is that like those kids had to be evacuated from England or from London to go live in the country. There's a few versions of Peter Pan where like they're evacuated from London to go live in the country. Like Nanny McPhee, they're evacuated from London to go live in the country, and then all of these kind of magical things happen to them, right? So I've been looking at, how did the London Blitz really affect kids? How successful were these, child evacuations? And is this something that kind of like collectively the psychology of people who experienced that then went on to go and like deal with that experience and that trauma in this form of like childhood escapism? Um, which all makes sense. It's just an interesting thing to look at, which also like isn't fieldwork dependent. I can talk to psychologists, I can talk to other historians, I can look at photographs, I can read oral histories and first person's accounts of living through the Blitz without having to go to London and try to like dig anything up. So, um, one avenue.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty important. I mean, if you look at the impact, I think a lot of people tend to focus on, like, especially in the United States, a lot of people focus on what happened over here rather than what happened in other countries. I mean, I was watching a video this morning. It was World War II veteran from the United Kingdom, and then he was talking to an average day veteran that fought in Iraq, and it was like just an exchange of like stories, and you could both see like how they were seasoned with like a little bit of like the pain that they suffered from over there, and just the experience that they had, and it was just different because like I think so many people think so like about where they're from. They think very, very locally, which in a way you're supposed to act locally to kind of affect globally, but we're not really concerned with everybody else's history. I think that's a valuable part about being at least part of the human species, is that we should be obsessed with other people's history as well too, what other people went through, especially getting the perspective. That's why I loved when I was learning about the Holocaust. I loved hearing experiences and then also reading journals from people that were writing these experiences, because it added a whole nother impact. I remember reading a diary of a Nazi soldier who was like, I'm afraid, I don't believe in any of this, and I'm afraid to leave because they're going to kill my family if I do. And it was like this whole other impact or perspective that went into your head of like, not, they weren't all wanting to be a part of this. Some of them wanted to leave, but they couldn't because their family would suffer. And I mean, at the ending of that dude's diary, he ended up did leaving, and they killed his wife and kid. And it was like this whole, like just reading that and having a different mindset of, or perspective of that story based on what I learned in school, which was just teaching me, this is how we defeated the Nazis. This is that, this is that. And then Operation Paperclip played a whole nother factor in the fact that they helped with our space program. And I'm like, information's fucking awesome. And I don't know why people don't want to, like, I don't know. I was never a reading person in school. Like I could read well. I just didn't want to. I'd rather play video games. But now that I'm older, I'm like, having a whole new perspective on like, it's a giant river of information, and I feel like we're only touching like a little bit of a stream, not even the full power source of it all.
I think there's like a quote, and I don't know who said it, but it's like, nobody doesn't like to read. It's that you haven't been given the right books, right? Like, imagine if when you were in high school, you had been, instead of being like, yeah, I hate reading and I want to just play video games, like, imagine if you had been, someone had like taken the time to really find out what you were super interested in and found a book to like really get you excited about it. And then like you could have like, gone down that like path of like, oh, hey, this book that I love, the author wrote another book that was great and it's on the same topic, and I found another book that's like a similar topic. So, there is so much information out there. And especially like around World War II, I think that like in our education system, we're really given like a very shallow perspective of like, just kind of like an overview of like what happened. Like, oh yeah, like we fought the Nazis and we fought in Japan, and like that there was this big war, and at the end of the war, like America was a superpower, and everybody in the United States agreed that we had to go out and get them. But like that's not necessarily true. Like, there was one person, one senator who voted against the declaration of war, and it was because they were a pacifist, and they were like, even though my party is telling me to vote this way and everyone else, and I see what happened at Pearl Harbor, like I was elected as a pacifist, so I'm going to stick to my principles even if I'm the only person who votes against this. So there's lots of that, but I think when we're in school, in elementary school, middle school, high school, we don't get into the individual stories and the individual experiences. I mean, maybe with the exception of Anne Frank, um, we don't get into like what it was like for Marines in the Pacific versus what it was like for soldiers in the army in the European theater versus, like what it was like in France versus what it was like in Italy. We don't get into what it was like on the home front because, the women's liberation movement really starts at the end of World War II. Because while we have this nice narrative that, like, after all these, women who went to factories to like shore up the war effort, like when the men came home, they were just happy to return to their day-to-day lives. Like, no, you gave them a taste of like working and being independent. Like they didn't, that's the catalyst for the women's liberation movement. We don't talk about Japanese internment until maybe briefly in high school. You don't really get into it unless you're taking college level courses in World War II. And so, we don't talk about how the reason that so many people got to go to Ivy League schools in the 50s and 60s was that they were using the GI Bill, but that most African Americans were denied their GI Bill benefits when they returned from World War II. And the admission standards for a lot of these Ivy Leagues at that time were a lot less. So, like, until you get down into the nitty gritty of like individual people's experiences and stories, you're missing out on like a huge portion of like the historic narrative.
I know I got a good
Which is
podcast for you to go on. I had a past guest. His name is James. I think it's Whitmore or Wilmore. He was does a World War II podcast, but he taught me about a Gold Star family, which
mhm.
was I think it's a mother or woman that lost her whole family in the war, so they would place a gold star on their window or something like that.
It's so the Gold Star families are still a thing. If the service member that is your spouse or child dies, you're a Gold Star family. My husband just finished active duty service in September of 2020, and Gold Star families are absolutely still a thing. You don't necessarily advertise it in the same way, but you're entitled to rights and benefits as a surviving spouse or surviving child. So yeah, but that's where the whole movie Saving Private Ryan is based off of, is a real family where this mother lost her husband and her sons. And so, it wasn't as extreme as in Saving Private Ryan, but they did make an effort to return like at least someone to her. So,
I think it's important. I mean, I went to the Pearl Harbor Museum or memorial in Hawaii. That was just a really rough experience because we talk about like, there's a whole nother perspective on it too. Cause a lot of them there, like especially there's a large Asian population that's there. And even going and visiting there, as we know not to take photos of like the names that are written into the stone that is on the memorial. You have to take a boat over these ships that
mhm,
are crashed under there. And when you're seeing this, you don't want to take photos. You just want to sit in silence and you're sad. There's an overall heavy energy in the air that kind of weighs everybody down. And some of the like we said, large Asian population that's there, they were taking photos, selfies, and acting like it was nothing. And you have to like, it was very, very hard. Like some people were getting upset with it. And you kind of have to look at it like I was, where I was like, yeah, I'm upset that they're doing that. But at the same time, it's a little bit different for them. I mean, they're probably affected in a different way, obviously, but to this it seems more like a spit on us rather than what it actually is. And it's just them, taking photos. It's nothing serious to get upset about. But a lot of people are getting upset because it's a very emotional place. And I mean, they experience it in a whole different way. I mean, that giant movement right now, Stop Asian Hate. I was watching the senator or the governor. I forgot what his name is, something, man, I really don't want to blank on his name, but he ended up lifting up his shirt in a viral video and showed his war scars. His whole entire chest was like burned. And he was talking about this makes me American. This not the color of my skin. And it was like, yeah, you got to see the other perspective of things too. And I hate to say it, but the example that really sticks in my head and when I actually physically felt that or emotionally felt that was when I was watching the movie Wolverine. And they were dropping the bombs and he saved that guy's life, but you saw like something we would never experience, at least through a history book, at least from our side or something like that. But you got to see that it was like they knew it was the end. They took a samurai sword and they stabbed it into themselves, an honorable death. And he saved that one guy's life from killing himself. And even though it was a movie, it still had the impact on me where I was like, shit, I never even thought about the other side's perspective because I think it's the example of like when something like that happens, people think more with emotion rather than thought. They don't really, if we get attacked or something, it's like we need to attack them back. That's my family or whatever. We take it as an emotional, like when someone says something about America, even though we can crap on America all day or say whatever, if somebody from another country says something on America, we immediately get defensive about it because this is the place that we live and it is an extension kind of ourself in a way. At least for me, that's the case. And I mean, I talk to Canadians and Australians and they kind of see it like, oh, well, you joke about it. I can joke about it too. But it's like the same thing with your family. You can joke about your family, but if someone else jokes about your family, it's a whole different scenario.
Yeah, I think that, you know, different cultures have different kinds of humor, so people just think of it differently. I think in the instance of, say, visiting Pearl Harbor, and then if you were to go visit Hiroshima, um, like, not like when I was at Pearl Harbor, to me, like, it was a lot more personal, and there was people taking pictures. I don't know what identity or, like, ethnicity they were. There was all, I was there alone, like, touring. So, for me, it was just important to, like, go and take it in. But I've been places where, like, to me, cathedrals aren't necessarily a place to, like, do a viral TikTok video or to, like, make a cute Instagram post. But I've been in cathedrals in Europe where, there's plenty of tourists doing that. I personally haven't been to Japan, but I imagine that, like, a lot of people there, if you were acting like that at Hiroshima or at, like, a temple or something, would, like, they would be on the other side of it, right? Like, they would be offended that we were taking pictures, or, like, we're offended that they're, maybe they're taking pictures. um, but just kind of like internally, I think a lot of native people experience that too, where, you go to Arizona and you go and look at these, like, ruins, and people are like, great, yeah, I want to buy an arrowhead and I want to buy a dream catcher. And for us, it's just like a thing, but for them, like, we're appropriating their culture, like, it's really like that is part of, like, their belief system.
I
And
went to
so
Arizona when I was 14, and I will 100% admit that's what I wanted to do, and I also bought a penny book, so
So yeah, but, like, you know what I'm saying? Like, wherever you are, whatever cultural site you're visiting, there is a chance that approaching that site from just your perspective and your lived experience is offending the people who that site is significant, spiritual, and cultural for them. So for you, like, visiting the Arizona was like a, not, I don't know if you're spiritual or religious, but was like a very impactful experience, right? But
it was beautiful.
maybe for, yeah, it is beautiful, and for me it was very impactful. um but, like, maybe somewhere else, is not going to be as impactful for you, which would be as super impactful for someone else, and the behavior that you and I might exhibit might cause offense to them. So when I visit places, I try to just be, like, as respectful as possible. And it's totally different too. Like, I've been to places where I've been told, like, hey, you need to wear long sleeves. And rather than be like, it's my body, I can do what I want, I'm like, all right, I'll wear long sleeves. Like, if that's what you need me to do, this is like a site that's important to you culturally, these are your cultural rules, I'll wear long sleeves. Um, and so it's just like steps to take. I mean, it's hard, and I think everybody is in a moment of learning right now. um and that's great, because I think that the more that we all learn and just kind of take a step back and say, like, hey, if I was visiting the cemetery that your family is buried in, would you like me to act this way? Because for my culture and my people, this is what that is. um so it's good to step outside yourself and look at other people's perspectives.
I think it takes a lot too. I mean, I've talked to plenty of people just from all over, and it's taken me, I mean, big steps from when I first started to where I'm at now to kind of try and understand that perspective. I mean, I'm not a parent, but I can see from losing a child what that would be like. I mean, I wouldn't be able to know what that exact feeling is, but I can sense what that pain is of just losing a human life or something like that. And it's crazy because I mean, I've ranted about this a couple of times in the past episodes, but what is pissing me off right now is when you say learning, I don't know if it's learning for the good though, because now, like, I just saw funding was being cut in the UK on a lot of their academic programs by $1.5 million because of the concept of it's science is now being in questioned, which is like, we're supposed to kind of have these researches, these theses out there, these things that people are studying to be able to understand and know more. But now people are like, well, no, you can't do that because that affects the way I feel. And I'm like, I get it. I understand the perspective of it, but I get scared because I'm like, I also want to like be able to understand things too. And I've kind of opened up to the fact that there's probably not an answer or definite answer to anything anymore. Everything's kind of open up in the air to be on the catch for it. But like, I was listening to a podcast. I don't know if you know who Eric Weinstein is.
I'm not familiar.
He's an evolutionary biologist, but he actually came out in a recent Joe Rogan podcast about talking about the fact of like Harvard will literally force you to stop your research to stay in good standing. Like if it doesn't fit Harvard's narrative, they're going to stop you from researching. They did the same thing to Obama when they asked him to release his transcripts about like, where he was from or he was going to lose his scholarship. They told him that he needed to move. They told the same thing to Eric Weinstein and like 4 other scientists. If you continue working on your research paper, well, we're going to need you to move. And it's like, but if I move, I can't focus on my theses. You're asking me to uproot my family to move. And it's like, yeah. And that's because they have a certain thing going on where they're getting like $300 million over a period of 10 years or something like that. And I'm like, there's so much shady shit going on. And I'm like, and people want to step on that. And I'm like, you don't understand. It's all bigger than you. I'm like, when are we going to get actual answers? When are people going to be free to do their science, free to do their research, to even if you get a PhD and you post a thesis paper, there are times you will have to step up to defend your theses that you put up. And I'm like, it's science is constantly be putting on trial. And I'm not religious. I'm not a scientist either. I'm just saying I can emphasize on the fact like you can't be tearing down people that are trying to have a conclusion on what this is or what that is, because we're all about trying to understand. But when it doesn't come to understanding another person's feelings or emotions, then it's bullshit. And I'm like, that doesn't make sense to me.
Well, like in that specific case, like tenure for professors is supposed to be that, right? It's supposed to be that like you get to this place, that you prove you're an expert, that you do all this work, that a university is going to pay you to do research, and you can do that research without worrying about, political consequences. And I don't mean political consequences like how we talk about elections. I mean like, you know, let's say a theory that you come up with is controversial within your field. And you're like, I don't want to publish on this because then no one's going to hire me, or, people are going to think that I'm crazy, or I need 10 years to really investigate it. So tenured professors are supposed to be, they're unfireable, right? So like that's supposed to be to protect them to be able to conduct really detailed, thorough research. But what's happening is places like Harvard, and really all academic institutions at this point, are eliminating the tenure system in favor of making money, right? Because they don't want to pay somebody all this money to teach students. Like they just want to churn out degrees. They don't care if you get a degree and there's no jobs for you. They don't care if you are doing really excellent work. They just want to get more kids to pay more tuition to, churn out degrees. And they want the research that you do to fit in with kind of like their brand, right? So Harvard only wants to hire professors who went to other Ivy League schools. Like they're not going to hire, like me who went to a California state school. Like I don't have the pedigree to be a professor there. Um, which is
That is
crazy because,
so fucking nuts to me.
right? But like I could be an expert, but it's become this whole thing. So when they pull funding from people or ask people to move or ask things to flex around, it's really detracting from the concept of like academia, of like what it could be or what it should be. Now, with that all said, like every major academic institution has a major reckoning coming towards it regarding like, I could talk about like endowments and funding and fundraising and all that stuff for days because it's crazy. But, like Brown right now, their students have organized to say that the reason Brown has a over $1 billion endowment is because its owners made their millions of dollars on the backs of slaves. So they're saying, like, let's figure out a way to rectify that. Maybe it's repatriation. Maybe it's, coming up with the funding for the descendants of those slaves to be able to go to this university for free. Maybe it's something else, but like figure something out. And their response to it is like, oh, we couldn't possibly afford to do that. But you could, like they could, just like Harvard saying, oh, we need to cut your funding because we don't like what you're doing. It's not that they can't afford to do it. It's just they don't want to. So academia is like a very strange place that makes a lot of people very unhappy, but it's the only place where you can really go and still live and like feed yourself and like do in-depth research that needs to be done. Um, and a lot of places feel like they need to step away from history and the humanities and like focus more on science because they feel like that has like more benefit for like general people, which sometimes I agree, like medicine and like, that's all great for people, but they spend so much money on like physics and astronomy. I feel like physics and astronomy are just as valid as history, archaeology, anthropology. Um, even like music and theater, like art gives us so much that cutting the funding because you don't like the kind of art that's being produced is just mind-boggling to me.
Have you ever seen the show Gotham?
Um, I think I've seen like an episode or two. I don't have cable. I just like have Hulu and Netflix.
I have who it's on Netflix.
Oh, is it okay?
But it's like a Batman Gotham City style, like it's a pretty good show. But the way that you are explaining academia or the major like funding programs, like that was just like Gotham, like crooked cops. Like it's just like this. Why you're like the way you're explaining it, it seemed like you were like, well, here's like the back door, and here's how you go fly under the. I'm like, why is it that damn difficult? You're not the first academic person to tell me that before. I've talked to an astrophysicist that talks about how difficult it is to be able to publish something just on the basis of people don't want to believe that to be true. And especially confronting with like astrology and things of that sort of makes it very difficult when you're trying to explain planets and someone wants to say it looks like a fish. So I think it's a fish. And it's like, we're at each other's throats more than we're doing a benefit to progress our species to a better form of understanding, which kind of makes it very, very difficult. And I'm like, this happened with, and I'll point back to Harvard because Harvard's probably where I got all my examples for is Harvard was making it harder for Asian kids to be accepted into their program because they were realizing they were having a large population of Asian people going there. And they were like, we don't want to be associated as an all Asian style. I'm like, so you're making it more difficult for them to be able to go to your school because you're afraid of how it's going to look, like how you're going to be like what, not known as the prestige white school that you want to. And it's just so freaking strange and weird to me. And even saying that as myself right now, people are gonna be like, "Hey, be careful! You're walking on thin line." Fucking, it's true shit going on. It's came out years ago, and now people are starting to realize that there's a big discrimination going on. And I'm like, man, we got to tear these schools up a little bit from the founding of it and kind of like go
Well,
back to the
and
start.
like that specifically, that whole admission scandal, it was based on a stereotype that their admissions was perpetuating. That's like all Asians want to be, doctors and lawyers, which is not, is not true. Like there's this stereotype about like first generation families from different Asian countries like want their kids to succeed. Every first generation parent wants their child to succeed. Like there's just as many amazing like artists and musicians and writers of like Asian descent who are amazing as there are, doctors and lawyers. There's just so much bias in admissions. There's so much bias in funding. It's mind-boggling. One of the things that like I contemplate going back and getting a PhD all the time. Like it was like a goal for the majority of my life. And now I'm not so sure if that's something I want to do when I see my friends and my colleagues and like how much grief they have to go through to get this, piece of paper that at the end of the day doesn't necessarily get you a better job or get you more opportunities or anything. Um, there are more women who hold PhDs than there are men, right? Like I think it's something like 65% of people who hold a PhD are women, and yet only 30% of professors are women. Like there's just so much discrimination and bias at every single level. That something really major has to change. I was looking at a program near where I live now, and my undergraduate research was about the Maya in the Yucatan Peninsula. My graduate research was about transatlantic slave trade. And I was like, yeah, maybe I want to kind of continue that, right? So I was looking at a program that kind of aligned. So of the 30 plus professors in their program, they were all white. Every single one of them was a man except for two. I'm like, I want to go and talk about like African diaspora. I want to go and talk about like how this is working. And I want to learn from somebody who has a different perspective than all of these people, because even if you study, even if you are like a world renowned expert, at the end of the day, the only perspective that you have is your own, right? Because that's your lived experience. And so when departments don't reflect any diversity, especially about the subject matter that they're saying they're an expert at, that can be really problematic too. Like, I don't think you would want to go into like an African American studies program that has no African American professors. Like, you're never going to get a complete or, interesting or diverse perspective, or like learn any new knowledge, if everybody that you go to study from looks just like you. So yeah, academia, people suck. It's the way
Maybe
of the world at the moment.
maybe I'm just an idiot, but like when I hear a story about the MMA fighter who had to walk like I think it was like two no, yeah, I think it was something ridiculous, like 200 miles or something like that from like his country to get into here. And then he had to work and make enough money while his family sat back here. He kept sending all his money home until he could finally bring them over here. And like doing this very, very heartbreaking story, this long haul where like why is it so difficult to for someone to even now, like even if you want to talk about the average of like someone trying to be able to afford a home by themselves or something like that, like it's very, very difficult to live and it's very, very difficult right now to make something of yourself. If it's not like certain things like being a vlogger or being like whatever is in the eye. Like I put a thing up on Twitter. I said people want to be a celebrity, but celebrities are telling you not to be a celebrity because of the fact they're constantly on the chopping block. I mean, Cher was just on the chopping block the other day. She tweeted during the George Floyd case and was like, if I was there, I would have done something. And then everyone's like, shut the fuck up. Like, you wouldn't have done anything. She's like, I cry in my, it was just this whole, like, are you looking for attention? But you look at this, like celebrities are like, don't be a celebrity. And then I see academics are like, don't be a fucking academic. You're not going to be able to do anything. And I'm just like, whoo, I need a cigarette or something. Like you just want to sit down and just like contemplate the world. Like, what's the point if every system, and I don't know if it's just, has it always been this way or is it just the fact that it's just being exposed now?
I think it hasn't always been this way, for sure. I used to joke that I wanted to live like the professor life, because I had one specific professor who, like, he taught 3 classes a semester, spent his summers doing field work like in Bermuda, like he like I was like, that's the life that I want. But he came into the academic system in the 80s when it was still doing what it was supposed to do. Um, and it really had like really, really transitioned pretty hard in the early 2000s, I think, with kind of like the pickup of the internet and the ability to do online courses, and really changing kind of like what college looked like completely. I think now, really, I mean, this is just like my perspective, but the only way to really succeed now is to not just do one thing, like, I think that my you know my dad, like, he's like a great example. My dad didn't go to college. Like, he worked his way up in one company for 25 years, and he worked his way to the top through like just hard work and sheer effort and being like a decent human being. And one of the things, he just retired, and one of the things that he was talking about was like, the guys that I'm hiring right now into the position that I started at, the way this is structured now, they can't get the same benefits. The same retirement package doesn't exist for them. They won't stay here for 25 years because they'll come in, they'll get some experience, and then they'll go to another company who's going to offer them something better or offer them something more long term. So, like, for me, I'm doing my job that pays the bills, and then I do my research on the side. And then when the world is not under COVID lockdown, I help other colleagues with their research and their field work and contribute there. Like, I had to take a little break from doing kind of social media and YouTube, just because like life stuff happens and some things have to take a back burner. But I, like, last week I talked to 600 high school students about World War II and how you can, what a professional historian does with World War II. And I, mentor students, and like, you have to do a lot of things to feel fulfilled on the things that are your dream, right? Like, my dream is to be an archaeologist and historian. What I'm doing to pay the bills isn't always archaeology and history, but I can like supplement it with other things to still feel like the thing that I'm really passionate about is being fostered. Um, and I think that's what everyone has to do, you know, like I just don't think there's a path where you can just do only one thing. Even like actors and actresses, like they get paid to be on TV, but then they also have to sell stuff. Like they have to take ad deals and promotional deals on their YouTube to, you know, pay the bills. And yes, their bills are much higher and they're getting paid a lot more. Um, but you know, like that's why people who are like, oh yeah, I have a blog and I have a YouTube and I have an Instagram and I have a Twitter and then I also have this online course, you know, like you can't, there's just no way to just do one thing. Um, anymore. And maybe that's the fault of the internet. Maybe that's the fault of developing technology, or, you know, I don't know. But I think that's like kids who I talk to who are like, I just want to grow up and be an influencer. Like, I just want to grow up and do YouTube. I'm like, that's great. But like, you have to still figure out what you're passionate about, what's going to set you apart, and like, you know, what you're going to develop. And then when you're 80, if your YouTube was all about you being in a bikini, like what are you going to do then? You know, like you have to like keep evolving and keep developing like your goals and diversifying. um and I wish it didn't have to be like that, but until something really significant changes and we start trusting experts again, I think that's just how it's going to go.
I agree, and I don't want to waste any more of your lunch break. I know you've been talking to me for the whole time of it, but Jess, thank you so much for joining me again on this podcast. Where can people find you at?
So I am everywhere as Jessica the Archaeologist, Instagram, Twitter occasionally, website. Um, and I will be getting back on YouTube soon to do all kinds of like history and archaeology videos. I'm hoping for mid-June, but things are just a little crazy here at the moment, so it's hard to sit down and edit, but I'm gonna get there.
Coming soon, Titanic was
Coming
actually
soon.
crushed by the Kraken.
I mean, that would be like a much more entertaining story if it was true, but
You would get a Nobel Prize for sure.
I would have so many people after me if I said that.